Welcome everyone. Good to have you all at this third Gender Talks. It's now being called Gender Talks as opposed to Yin-Yang Feminism. I found the word Yin-Yang Feminism, based on my conversations with everyone, was a little too triggering. Both males and females do get a bit triggered by that word. And so we're just doing Gender Talks, which is a lot more expansive and doesn't have any ideology behind it. It's just very neutral, which is what we're trying to do with the Yin-Yang framework for discussing gender issues, is to basically do it from a non-ideological point of view. The Yin-Yang is the perfect symbol. It's about balance. It's not about one dominating the other. And so today's subject is the feminism of feelings. Trauma, victimhood, and the cost of moral inflation. Sounds pretty heavy because it is a little bit heavy. When I speak about the modern feminist movement, now it emerged in the United States from injustice. Women were excluded from education, from political power, financial independence, bodily autonomy. There was a lot of injustice that existed prior. So naming harm was necessary. Speaking openly about things like sexual violence broke centuries of silence, and it saved lives. However, over time, things began to shift. Protection slowly replaced agency as the emotional center of the feminist movement. Safety became the highest value. Female fear became a moral signal. Victimhood was not only acknowledged, but it was increasingly centered as a defining feature of female identity. Language plays a powerful role here. Words like unsafe, triggered, violated, and traumatized, they're often used to describe a wide range of experience. And what happened is those words began to mean more and more things, everything from violent assault to social discomfort. So female vulnerability began to replace female agency as the moral core of feminism. Safety became the highest good. Men, in turn, were increasingly framed not simply as individuals capable of harm, as all humans are, but as a collective group requiring regulation, restraint, and a kind of never-ending suspicion. Many advocacy efforts promoted broad legal and social frameworks, and they promoted them with women, positioning women as primarily in need of continual protection. These frameworks, they often shaped expectations of male behavior in ways that to many men felt less like fairness and more like a presumption of group guilt. Now, critics argue that this adversarial framing of women as victims of the male patriarchy, it shifted away from addressing real problems of genuine misogyny to policing language. I'm going to stop at each little section to give you guys any moment to have any questions, and then I'll go on to the next one.
I have a question. So
Fire away.
you said moral inflation. What is that? That really stuck out, that phrase.
So moral inflation is when, for instance, we all know what sexual assault is. At least we have a working definition in our heads, and it usually involves something very aggressive. For instance, like rape. Now, what has happened with moral inflation is certain words like assault, rape, have become inflated into other areas where words, for instance, that were, say, aggressive or just a little bit edgy could be termed assault, could be termed a hate crime, could be termed a violation. And there's where you have the moral inflation. Whereas in the past, we had very specific definitions of what counted as sexual harassment, as rape, as assault, as those things. With the moral inflation, you've got now a way broader range of categories of, in this case, male behavior that can now be classified as rape and assault, and using some of those stronger words. So that's the moral inflation. It's the expansion of the meaning of these words. Does that
Yeah.
answer?
So I wrote like using strong words for ordinary situations and thus diluting their significance.
Yes, you
I
got
would,
it.
Expanding them. I'm going to write that down. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Mojo, I would add one that to me is a really obvious example is trauma.
Yeah. Oh God. Wait till I get into that one. Yes.
Oh, I said that today because my mom and I are going to New Orleans next week. And I'm like, I'm still traumatized from my big suitcase on my last trip. I'm bringing a small one. I'm still traumatized. I have PTSD. I can't get over it. Like, I'm joking. I'm exaggerating.
No,
Right.
but you
Say
won't
that.
believe
People say that for real. But I was like, I'm joking because I was
Right,
like,
but among friends, and one of them being a professional also, we've come to now qualify the word with little t trauma or big T trauma, right?
good point. That is a very good point.
Just
But
I
to
don't know. I don't know what that means.
well, little
just
T. You
go
explain it,
ahead,
David.
Mojo.
I've heard
No,
the
go ahead.
expression before.
Yeah, go ahead, Mojo. You got it.
No. Well, little T trauma would be like things like your mom wasn't nice to you when you were a kid, and somehow it affects your behavior later as an adult. Big T trauma would be like you got raped as a kid, like something horrible happened to you. And so there are little traumas, like there's definitely some things, I got a lot of commentary about my height when I was a kid, and that definitely has affected me growing up as an adult. But I was, like I never didn't get some of those big T traumas, except for Islam, what Islam did to me. That was, I guess, one of my big T traumas. So I see the point, but the problem is many times people really talk about little T traumas as like big things requiring years of therapy, and they, again, morally inflated.
Or
Was that,
even
go ahead.
another example is that someone yelled at me, right?
Yes.
As a little T trauma. So
Thank you. That is a better example than my one. Yes.
The guy at Safeway was an asshole, and it ruined my whole day.
I need therapy. I need to see my counselor. All right. So number 2 is when victimhood becomes institutional. At many Western universities, emotional harm caused by language is treated with a seriousness. This is the moral inflation that many critics argue approaches the moral weight once reserved for physical injury. Language itself is treated as a weapon. And what happens is when emotional harm is elevated to the level of physical injury, boundaries blur, discomfort becomes dangerous, disagreement becomes a threat. There used to be a wonderful old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. This insight, once taught to children, myself included, that words can hurt without destroying us, it's been quietly abandoned. Words are now widely seen as capable of causing lasting psychological damage, sometimes requiring therapy and therapeutic intervention. The identity of victim is expanded into related terms: survivor, brave, traumatized, each carrying moral weight and social authority. In institutional settings, universities, workplaces, online platforms, and policies, they increasingly prioritize subjective emotional experience over intent, context, and proportionality. The person who feels harmed is granted near absolute authority to define the harm based solely on their subjective experience. This focus can unintentionally encourage lifelong identity formation around negative experiences. I feel triggered by, I'm a survivor of rape, I'm a victim of abuse, I'm traumatized by, I'm unsafe around. These words sound noble, and therapists who use them mean well. However, instead of trying to move beyond or cure, the end result is that these words often become permanent social identities. Trauma becomes not something that happened, but something one is. The shift has consequences. It discourages honest conversation. It rewards emotional escalation. It trains people, especially young women, to interpret social friction as trauma. Strength is not built this way. Confidence does not grow under constant warnings. When trauma becomes the organizing principle of selfhood, so the psychological costs can deepen rather than heal. I'm going to pause for questions now. Fire away, guys.
I mean, I think that people are definite, like, it's normal to be like traumatized or have this if something bad happens to you, but when people are like, oh, I was traumatized by something that was really minor, then I think it kind of takes away the power from people who have had something really serious happen. And it's like kind of like I don't want to say taking resources away, but it's like if everybody on the earth is traumatized, then someone comes and says, oh, I'm really traumatized by this, then it's like, oh yeah, you and everybody else, versus like reserving that for somebody that really has been through it, really like something terrible, you know?
Right. Yeah, no, 100% right. It's that's the big T and the little t trauma that we were talking about. And it's where I'm going with this, though, and I'm going to be getting into it more, is even with big T trauma, when it becomes an identity rather than something that happened to you, which you're working through to try to cure, that is where there are heavier psychological consequences. So I won't say too much about it because I'm going to be talking about it more, but I will go into that in more depth.
Actually, Mojo, that was one thing I was going to relate to is,
Sure.
I've seen kind of a shift in terms of in therapy. Well, I have to be a little bit careful about this, right? I haven't seen it personally in my own therapy, but I'm saying that through stories others have related to me, that there seems to be less of an emphasis in terms of moving someone beyond the trauma that they endured.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm literally going to go into that right now because this identity thing is really having major costs, especially for women. But let me continue on, and then that way it'll highlight a little bit more of what you were just saying. So, in clinical psychology, distinguishes between trauma that is integrated and trauma that becomes identity. When harm becomes the organizing principle of selfhood, when someone says, this is who I am, their personal agency shrinks. Now, psychology has long explored what is called victim mentality, a worldview where individuals perceive themselves primarily experiencing life as something that happens to them, not something that they shape. The phrase is cultivating an internal locus of control. When one cultivates an internal locus of control, the belief that one's actions correlate with resilience and psychological strength. They're in control of their outcomes. Studies have repeatedly found that people who believe that they can influence outcomes show greater resilience, motivation, and life satisfaction. On the converse side, an external locus of control is the belief that outcomes are governed primarily by outside forces. Those taught to interpret events primarily through external forces report higher distress. Psychologists note that when people consistently frame themselves as victims, they experience reduced agency, motivation, and resilience. Now, in contemporary American feminist narratives, and I say American, but I mean Anglo-American, because it's the English-speaking world that has this a lot of these similar narratives. So in contemporary feminist narratives, the external locus of control is called the patriarchy. This perspective can help explain a paradox of modern America and modern feminism. Despite unprecedented access to education and professional opportunity, many college-educated women report high levels, even higher than in many poor countries, high levels of anxiety, dissatisfaction, and emotional distress. In America, US women report among the highest rates of anxiety and depression in the developed world, according to a study by OECD. The CDC found that over 1/4 of American women take prescription psychiatric medication. Now, to be clear, correlation is not causation, but the parallel rise of safety-first feminism and deteriorating mental health among women is difficult to ignore. When trauma becomes the organizing principle of selfhood, women remain vigilant. However, chronic vigilance alters psychology. Cortisol stays elevated. Dopamine becomes dysregulated. A woman who believes her body is always under threat cannot inhabit desire without fear. Desire becomes instead confused with threat. When a woman is trained to see danger everywhere, her body never relaxes. The nervous system never stands down. The body never fully returns to trust. It remains in vulnerability rather than growth. Psychological research has shown that when people adopt a stable identity built around victimhood, their sense of agency shrinks, it declines. Life is experienced as something that happens to, in this case, women, rather than something women shape. The overlap between a feminism emphasizing constant threat to women's declining mental being is difficult to ignore. Let me pause for questions. Fire away, guys. We're all good on that one?
Actually, this one's really fascinating to me, Mojo, because I don't know if it's related or if it's a different cause and effect. And like you said, it's a causal relationship. They haven't just determined cause and effect, right?
Yeah.
But there's also a causal relationship between single people and married people. And what I read was really disturbing to me is even people in unhappy relationships or marriages outlive those that are single.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I was just talking to a friend this morning where I was hypothesizing that it might be elevated cortisol, and that always, like being single, always being on the alert, that leads to the increased feelings of exhaustion and other things that we had both been noticing.
Does that apply to single men too? Do you know?
Well, I, I can say I'm a man and I feel it. But yeah, it would be interesting to know if there's a wider study that's been done. So I don't pretend to have the answer, but I'm just saying that it's something that I've noticed.
I think
I like this. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say I like this evil octopus that you've got as the patriarchy. That's funny. Sorry, makes me laugh for some reason.
I've been having so much fun with AI generating these images to broadly illustrate the themes I'm talking about. It's to respond to that thing. I don't have data about male depression, but what I do know is, so taking aside the issue of singlehood versus a relationship, one of the things about being a guy is that when guys are talking to each other, for instance, we are moving towards a more therapeutic culture, but before, guys had this thing called stoicism, where guys would be like, suck it up, just, don't show emotion, just barrel through, just go through it, don't just dwell in your trauma.
Suffer in silence.
Right. Now, that had its own costs. Some guys bottled up so much that when it finally exploded, it did so in horrible ways. But what they found is that many guys do have benefits where they barrel through things, where they're stoic, get through it like I'm a Marine. I can just bust through this and come out on the other side. And there is an element of that stoicism. So in terms of looking at it yin yang, men could definitely learn a little bit more of the therapy culture from femalehood, but women could also learn a little bit of the stoicism from malehood. And so that's one of those things where I see like a yin yang, each can learn from the other. So I'm going to go on to victimhood and trauma as identity. This is where it gets really crazy when we're talking about big T trauma, because I'm going to give an example here, which is very relevant to today's times. So to give the intro, psychologists distinguish between trauma that is integrated and trauma that becomes identity. Integrated trauma deepens wisdom. Identity-based trauma freezes time. In modern American feminism, victimhood became a moral position rather than a temporary state. The language of survivor, for instance, it's meant to empower, but when it becomes permanent, it can quietly lock women into that moment of injury. Being believed becomes confused with being healed. Now, this does not mean that trauma is imagined or exaggerated. It means trauma can be interpreted in different ways. Some interpretations, they open the future, and others close it. Healing requires something modern feminism really offers, a way back into the body without fear. Trauma research has long warned that repeated narrative exposure without integration can entrench suffering rather than heal it. And the example I'm going to give is Virginia Giuffre. So Virginia Giuffre is a cautionary tale. I might not be pronouncing her name well. Not only of sexual exploitation, but what can happen when identity becomes permanently fused in trauma. So after being abused, by Jeffrey Epstein, who we all know, doesn't need any introduction now. Jeffrey became the public face of his victims. She testified, she litigated, she gave repeated interviews about her trauma. She even published a memoir about the harm that she experienced, which caused her to continually revisit rather than resolve her trauma. Her story did not move cleanly from injury to rebuilding, but it remained anchored in repetition, with public recognition reinforcing constant return to the wounds that were visited upon her. Jeffrey committed suicide in 2023. Now, no single story explains a life or an ending, but her trajectory raises a difficult question for modern feminism. Whether a culture that encourages women to live inside their trauma risks trapping them there, and whether frameworks centered on resilience, agency, and forward motion rather than permanent injury might better serve women in the long run. Let me pause for questions. That was a bit of a heavy one, so how you guys doing there?
I think it's interesting that you said Jeffrey Epstein became the public face of his victims, because it's like they're the ones speaking.
Virginia Jeffrey. So, sorry, did I read? Yeah, not
Well,
Jeffrey Epstein. No, he's the monster.
But he is kind of, in some way, he is the face of all the victims. Like, everybody knows him, but they don't know the victims. Like, they know his face and they know him, but they don't know, like, they don't know each individual person. And it's like, it's kind of weird. Like, it's a kind of the more people speak out, the more he gets attention, and then the more people know his name, which is, yeah, because he's a monster. But maybe does he want the attention? Does he like the attention? Are they somehow, like, I don't know, like, it would be probably worse for him to, like, be killed off in silence and no one ever knows his name, like giving him more recognition. It's like the guy who killed Abraham Lincoln. He's like, I just want to be famous. I don't even care what I have to do it. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
He is like, everybody knows Jeffrey Epstein, but we don't know all of the women that he hurt. And it's like, I wonder if they're upset about that. Like, oh, they know him, of course, everybody knows him, but they don't know who I am. Like, some of them might get lost in the shadows. You know what I mean?
Well, part of that is to protect them. So society usually allows women the option, if they've made an accusation in serious crimes, to remain anonymous. And partly that's to protect them. Now, Virginia Jeffrey, the woman who I'm talking about, she chose to be public about her pain. And she did. She was on the media. I saw her on TV, really reliving continually the pain that she went through as a young woman, and it didn't help her. Now the conversation about Jeffrey Epstein and often male people who commit violent crimes or assaults and this, that, the other, and they do it for fame, that is a completely separate conversation. With regards to Jeffrey Epstein, I don't think he was doing it for fame, because he had millions and billions and everything like that. And he allegedly killed himself in his jail cell. So the fame factor for him is not as pertinent as one as, say, for instance, a mass shooter or a serial killer, where there is an element of self-glorification in one way. So, but what I'm focusing on is the women who do identify with their trauma in this big way. That is where I'll be talking about it a little bit more here. to then get to some of the bigger points. So does that answer a little bit of what you said, Dune? And then I'll go into the next section that maybe explain it a little bit. All right.
Mojo,
Cool.
I think the point you were trying to make is that by reliving that and constantly being stuck in that, being framed by the media and others as a victim, then that starts to become part of their identity. That was my takeaway from.
That's the only thing people know her for, right?
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And then it by itself, then that also makes it more difficult.
Yes.
For the person to move beyond that as their identity.
Yeah, it's like
100%.
they're always saying, well, don't let XYZ define you, but in this case, it's like it kind of does, right?
It does. Yeah.
Yep.
Wait till you see some of the other examples I give now, because that's going to really bring the point home in ways that are just crazy. Like as I began doing the research, it was just getting wilder and wilder. So sorry, it looks like one of you guys wanted to say something. No.
Nope, I covered it. Yep.
All right. So the difficulty arises when language collapses behavior and crime into the same moral category. When words are treated as violence, discomfort is treated as danger, free speech becomes fragile. Critics argue that contemporary feminism often blurs the line between criminal assault and unpleasant or awkward sexual encounters. Unwanted flirtation can be labeled harassment. Persistent attention can be framed as a threat. In extreme cases, it can be rhetorically elevated to sexual assault. There is a frequently repeated claim that 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted. It has enormous emotional power. Many women hear this number and internalize a sense of vulnerability. Fear becomes anticipatory. Vigilance becomes a way of life. This statistic of 1 in 4 became a moral hammer repeated so often that many women carry it in their bodies as a quiet expectation of violation. Now, it turns out there were flaws in the way this statistic was constructed. Vastly different experiences were grouped together under one category. Violent rape, intoxicated encounters, verbal pressure, unwanted touching. They were all folded together into a permanent identity of extreme injury. The pain women carry is real, like we're not denying that. Each experience matters. None should be dismissed. But when vastly different experiences are collapsed into one statistic, fear can spread faster than understanding. It can unintentionally exaggerate danger while reducing clarity. Women pay the psychological price. Emotional injury is now often equivalent to physical injury. It's treated the same way. This grants immediate moral authority to the person who feels harmed, while discouraging proportionality, context, and resilience. There was a professor, Christina Hoff Sommers, she called it fainting couch feminism, drawing a comparison to the Victorian norms that encourage women to perform fragility. So many times women in college now need a safe space where certain words, if guys say them, are triggering, and they're in trauma now, and they see it as almost the equivalent of assault. And meanwhile, it could be just guys making bad jokes with each other. And it has created less and less resilience among many women, many young women. And that's what Christina Hoff Sommers calls the fainting couch feminism, because it's almost like a full circle between how women were seen back in the Victorian times as fragile and men should never say bad words around them, to today, where in the college atmosphere, women are fragile, and if men say bad things around them, boom, it can trigger trauma. So I'll pause here for questions.
Well, not just triggered trauma, but can cause real consequences for people saying those words. You know, I've had personal experiences where that default assumption of guilt and on the part of the accused, and then the default assumption of you know truth on the part of the accuser, even if it is just words that were said, has been weaponized against me before. So that creates a very chilling effect.
Yes, there's personal stories. I know big picture stories of people it's happened to in Portland and elsewhere. Even in India, where I'm at right now, I've seen, like, speaking to people here, a lot of Indian law and Indian college discourse follows the American model. And so a lot of the same things that happen in America when it comes to this issue, as you described it, David, it's happening here as well. And it is, it really is scary. Like, men are many times terrified, and women are also terrified because they've kind of been taught to be terrified. And so you've got this easily getting triggered on both sides. And in my next section, when feelings become the law, I go into that depth a bit more, David.
Even beyond that, Mojo, it's yet another thing that I feel like has created two different classes, right, within people, and then now serves to divide us, not
Yes.
unite us.
100%. 100%. That's why I'm trying this yin-yang approach, because I'm trying to work towards bridging the divide rather than continual separation. So the next section is when feelings become the law. Now, sexual violence is real, harassment is real, abuse is real, but when language includes crime, awkwardness, and desire into a single moral category, confusion follows. When words are treated as violence, free speech erodes. When discomfort is treated as danger, resilience collapses. Contemporary discourse often blurred the line between violent assaults and confusing sexual encounters. So it relates a bit to what you were saying. This doesn't help anyone. It leaves women fearful of their own desire. It leaves men paralyzed by fear of accusation. And it leaves truth buried under moral noise. Public policy has absorbed the emotional logic. Mandatory arrest laws, campus tribunals, and family courts often operate under an assumed script. Women are the victim, men are the threat. Now, acknowledging complexity does not excuse harm. It just restores accuracy. Justice built on ideology erodes trust. Justice built on evidence restores trust. When systems are built on ideology rather than evidence, injustice follows. Men who report abuse are often not believed. Families at the end of cases like this are often fractured. Children lose stable relationships with their fathers. women are not made safer by distorted truth. Data from large population studies show a more complex picture of intimate partner violence, for instance. Non-lethal aggression is often reciprocal. And I believe this is an American statistic. Women initiate physical conflict at rates similar to men in many age groups. However, men are more likely to cause serious injury when the violence escalates. Now, acknowledging this does not excuse male violence. It just corrects a narrative that oversimplifies human behavior. Questions?
One thing, there was a word you said earlier in the previous segment that I thought was really important is proportionality.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the part that I have the hardest time with, is not seeing the proportionality in terms of the response. Like you said, where everything is treated the same.
Right. That's the moral inflation that we were discussing. It's when things become conflated into this bigger picture, and it's like, hold on, whoa, I just gave you a compliment. It's not assault. And that, yeah, that is where a lot of this confusion is creates more division. Now, any other comments? Because the next section is one where it gets really interesting. We good? All right. So now I'm going to do the Islamic comparison, extreme yang. So in many Western feminist spaces, victimhood has now been elevated and protected. In many Muslim majority countries, victimhood is punished. In Islamic honor-based legal and social systems, women who report rape often face imprisonment, forced marriage, or violence from their own families. In certain jurisdictions, a woman's testimony carries less legal weight, and rape allegations require cooperation standards that are nearly impossible to meet. The result is predictable. Silence becomes a survival strategy, so the women in Muslim countries are often more silent. Now, to be clear, this is not an indictment of all Muslims, but it is a critique of specific Islam-based legal and cultural systems where honor codes and moral policing override female bodily autonomy. In Muslim majority societies, and this has been documented by organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, women who report rape may face imprisonment, forced marriage, or death. There are documented cases in which rape victims were prosecuted for adultery or publicly punished for immorality, in quotes. They were blamed for their clothing, their presence in public, or their refusal of male authority. In one widely reported Saudi case in Saudi Arabia, a woman who reported gang rape was sentenced to prison and flogging for what is called zina, like she was the temptress. Though later pardoned, the message was unmistakable. Silence is safer than truth. The consequence is not safety, it's impunity. A culture that punishes women in reporting violence does not reduce assault, it ensures it remains hidden. Now, the irony is that Western feminist movements often hesitate to address what's happening in Muslim majority countries forcefully. They cite cultural sensitivity or fear of appearing Islamophobic. Western and American feminist responses to the realities that these women face in Muslim majority countries, it's often muted. The paradox here is striking. Western feminism amplifies victimhood where consequences are survivable, but it often falls silent when consequences are lethal. Cultural relativism replaces moral clarity. However, in both systems, you have a permanent victim identity in the West, permanent victim blaming in the Muslim world. Both freeze women in the moment of violation. The result is a moral imbalance where women face social discomfort, outrage is loud. Where women face prison or death, silence is common. The two extremes emerge. Both extremes trap women. One traps them in fragility, the other one traps them in shame. In one, women are punished for violation. In the other, women are preserved in it. Western feminism, American feminism, worships the wound. In Islam, the wound is punished. Neither extreme frees women, neither offers transcendence. Neither honors the full capacity for human adaptation, whether it's the extreme Western yin or the extreme Islamic yang. Let me pause for questions now.
That's interesting. Like when I lived in Malaysia, I heard stories about like if a woman is raped, normally the man would be punished unless he marries her, and then it's like it does
Yes.
it kind of count. And
Yeah.
I was really shocked when I heard that. But it's interesting to hear that it's the case in a lot of other places too, or even worse.
56 countries, I think there's 56 Muslim majority countries, and in the majority of them, there is that element of the female is punished for acts of rape. And one way to restore honor is if the rapist marries the woman who he raped. So just think about that as justice, you know? It is horrifying. And yet, in this cultural relativism in the West, you very, very seldom hear Western feminists condemning this, even though it's one of the most egregious examples of old school, really medieval patriarchy. And yet, in the name of, we don't want to be Islamophobic, we don't want to be culturally intolerant, we want to be culturally relative, you know, it's just not commented on. The silence is striking. And I've watched this, being interested in women's issues for my whole life. I've watched this double standard of silence throughout my life, where it's like, wow, oh, they're Muslim, so they can do what they want to their women. And oh, in the West, though, any transgression is, boom, amplified. So it is a fascinating cultural thing to see.
I wonder if people just don't know about it. They have this romanticized idea of other cultures and about, you know, about whatever, like, oh, we don't understand their culture, we should be tolerant. They have this romanticized idea of foreign religions, and they actually don't understand what goes on behind closed doors. Maybe they just they really don't know about it. And if they knew what you were talking about, they would be less keen to, you know, talk so freely about something, you know?
Right. Dude, you've done the best segue into my next section, because that's literally what I'm talking about. It is, oh my God, I could not have introduced the next section better. You exactly introduced it perfectly. And so I will run into it right now because you did such a perfect segue. So adaptation, resilience, and forgotten women. Now, speaking and relating to what you just said, Dune, Anthropologists and historians have long noted that women across cultures have adapted to catastrophic circumstances like rape, war, displacement, sexual violation, without collapsing into permanent pathology. Now, it does not deny pain. This does not, it simply acknowledges human adaptability. The human nervous system evolved not only to register threats, but to recover from them. Women have survived capture, war, famine, occupation, and mass rape, not by permanent collapse, but by situational strength. And so this is where it gets interestingly into culture. And one culture is Native American. So American feminists have often, they romanticize Native American cultures as inherently egalitarian or matriarchal. There are even frequently cite examples like the Iroquois, where women held influence over property and clan heritage. They use that as examples of pre-patriarchal, matriarchal cultures. However, this romantic framing tends to overlook the realities of intertribal warfare, captivity, and coercion that also governed indigenous life. And you had in many cultures around the world where this concept of rape and pillage, societies fight each other, one side wins, you kill the men, and then you assault and take the women as captives, who will then be the mothers of the next generation. Now, I'm going to give 3 examples of 3 very human stories of women in history who adapted under very challenging circumstances. One of them, her name was Cynthia Ann Parker, a white American female. She was captured in 1836 by Comanche warriors at the age of 9. Obviously, her first experiences in relationships in that thing were forcible, were coercive, would be called rape. However, she became fully integrated into her new tribe. She married the Comanche chief, Pete Nakona, and she bore him 3 children, including someone named Quenna Parker, who became a legendary Comanche leader. Eventually, she was rescued by Texas Rangers in 1860. However, even though she was white and she was back with her people, she resisted assimilation into white settler society. She attempted several escapes to go back to her Native American tribe. Separated from her children, stripped of her language, clothing, and community, Cynthia withered. She refused food. She mourned constantly. She died young. Her story shows that identity, belonging, and even love can arise after initial coercion, complicating modern assumptions about trauma's permanence. The next example is a lady named Mary Jameson. She was released by Shawnee and French forces in 1753 after being captured and living with a Native American tribe. The Seneca tribe, that is. She ended up choosing to remain with her tribe, the Seneca tribe, for the rest of her life. Her dictated memoir describes both violence and integration, but crucially, does not frame her entire life through a single act of early violation. Her story illustrates a pattern found in numerous captivity narratives. The traumatic event does not define the existence of the female, It doesn't define her identity, nor does it define her human happiness, her future happiness. The third final case is a lady named Ilse Schwab. She was a German woman living in a small town in 1945. The small town was Silesia in Germany. This was when Germany was losing the war. It was facing the imminent arrival of Red Army Soviet troops. Ilse knew what was coming. Rumors drifted through the German villages. Soviet soldiers were sexually assaulting German women wherever they went. Before the Red Army arrived in her village, she gathered the women of her town, and then she negotiated with the Soviet Red Army officers. She asked them to follow a protocol. You can assault the woman only once, not repeatedly. Do not assault or beat elderly women, and do not harm children. The soldiers agreed. It was horrific, but it spared lives, reduced brutality, and allowed the women to live on afterwards. Though the Soviet occupation involved massive sexual violence, estimates are anywhere from 1.6 to 2 million women were raped. Schwab's case shows that women have used resilience and agency, even in desperate circumstances, to mitigate harm. Now, these stories do not romanticize violence. They simply complicate the assumption that rape necessarily produces lifelong psychological ruin. Modern trauma research supports this. Studies summarized by the National Institute of Health, they show that the majority of people exposed to traumatic events do not develop chronic PTSD. Recovery is the norm, not the exception, especially when individuals are encouraged towards meaning, agency, or forward motion. Human resilience is variable. Culture shapes recovery. Let me get some questions before I go to the final section.
The first two cases that you talked about,
Mhm.
It seems like very similar to essentially like Helsinki syndrome, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So how would you separate the two in terms of how do you determine what is Helsinki syndrome versus, I mean,
Stockholm
I guess,
syndrome, I think you're
or,
talking about.
okay, sorry, maybe I got that wrong.
Yeah. No, I know the story you're talking about where the woman was kidnapped by terrorists and then she ended up becoming a terrorist.
Well, it doesn't even have to be women, right? It happens with men as well, right? Where prisoners start sympathizing with their captors after a period of time.
Yeah. It is a very gray line. I am not going to claim that I have any kind of defining tool to separate. But what we do when we're faced with situations like this is we look at the polarities to try to find some way to understand it. And so while what you say is very true, there is a Stockholm syndrome where people can identify with their captors and actually reduce their own agency. The examples I'm looking at is where people adapt into a situation and still are able to prosper and move on in their life afterwards. So it is, yeah, you're very right. It's a really fine line because, were they indoctrinated, or not? Arguments could be made for that. But there is the unmistakable thing of human adaptability, meaning when people are in crazy situations, they adapt to it. However, in Western therapy culture and modern feminism, people are taught another program, which is to dwell in the trauma as an identity. And all I'm arguing for, or I shouldn't even say arguing, all I'm trying to postulate and put forward is evidence to say that there are other ways than wallowing or staying in victimhood, but one can adapt and move on. There are cultural examples, and I can give you one example, and that happened to me here in India while I was doing research for this. I spoke to an Indian woman who'd been gang raped in India, and she was a psychologist, interestingly enough. And I'm hanging out with her and her boyfriend, and she's laughing and she's happy, and we're chatting and we're making all kinds of politically incorrect jokes and comments. And then we start talking about what happened to her. And I'll never forget what she did, her way. She was like, she looked at me and she was like, Mojo, do you know what rape is? And I was like, not personally, no. And then she's like, put out your hand. So I put out my hand like this. And she just took her two fingers and she did this. She's like, that's what rape is. It's friction. That's it. And I was like in shock. I was like, wow, if I told that to any white woman in the West, they would freak out at me. There's no way. But at the same time, I was like, wow, you have taken this way of looking at it. You've adapted to this way of looking at this horrendously traumatic incident and just reducing it to the most, just to this physical act of friction, but it does not define who she is. It is not something that governs her every way of being. And hanging out with her and her partner, she did not seem at all traumatized. She was laughing, joking. And as I said, we were joking about all kinds of politically incorrect subjects. I did not feel any of this lingering trauma that I see in the West. And I still remember when she did that action, the friction, I was like, wow, if I said this in the West, I would just be crucified for trying to say anything like that as a way of adapting and moving on. And so that is, that's the point I'm trying to make in this section. But
so it sounds like she was really able to integrate that that experience that she had and the harm that came from it, and then actively decide how much she was going to let it continue harming her versus recovering from it.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's the point, is that, you know, we have a lot more agency than we give ourselves credit for. I've had trauma in my life. I grew up with racial incidents. You know, I had, growing up in London in the time when I was growing up there, it was very racial. And there was they would call it packy bashing, where they would just beat up Indians. And I definitely got packy bashed quite a few times. So I could have residual trauma from that. Every time I see white people, I'm like a little scared or whatever, a little triggered, but I'm not. I've been hanging out with white people my entire life. Most of the languages I speak are all white. I'm totally comfortable. You know, I dated, socialized, hung out, had friends, everything with white people, and not traumatized by it at all. You know, I've never forgotten what happened to me. I use it every now and then if I have to illustrate a story, but I'm not defined by it. And that is the point, what I'm trying to bring across in this segment for women, is that if you're defined by your trauma and don't choose the internal resources you have to adapt and even use that experience to grow from it and move on in life, then it often is not, you don't get helped in the end. Like, you may remain stuck in that place of pain. And that, sad to say, is what American feminism and Western feminism in general has done to women, especially today's generation. I will go to the last section, which is yin yang. So I try to end every one of these presentations with a yin yang framework, because in the end, it's, the idea is to be able to have difficult conversations, to be able to talk about difficult issues, but not just end on a sour note, but to try to find ways to bring that balance again in a yin yang framework. Women are not floating minds attached to danger narratives. They are biological beings whose nervous systems respond to stories. When culture constantly tells women they are unsafe, the body listens. Cortisol rises, vigilance becomes chronic, anxiety becomes normalized. This is not liberation. A balanced feminism, one worthy of women, holds both yin and yang. Yin honors vulnerability, care, and emotional truth. Yang restores strength, boundaries, and responsibility. Without yin, injustice festers. Without yang, fear mesticizes. The problem is not that feminism named female suffering in cases of rape and sexual assault. The problem is that it forgot balance. Balance is not denial. Balance is not blame. Balance is how women survive and thrive without shrinking. When yin and yang are restored to balance, resilience returns. Not denial, not blame, balance. The yin principle honors vulnerability. It honors empathy, care, and emotional truth. Without yin, pain is denied and injustice festers. Yang brings boundaries, agency, and responsibility. Yin without yang becomes fragility, passivity, and moral inflation. Without yang, protection turns into paralysis. A healthy society and a healthy woman requires both. Women deserve protection and respect for their strength. Men deserve accountability and recognition of their humanity. Trauma deserves compassion and a path beyond it becoming an identity. Mary Jameson, Cynthia Ann Parker, Ilsa Schwab, they did not have the language of empowerment. They had lived intelligence, they adapted, they endured. They were not defined by what happened to them, but by what they did next. Yin-Yang feminism does not deny pain, nor does it kneel to it. Compassion does not require fragility. A wound can be honored without becoming a crown or a mark of shame. That balance, fully embodied, sober, and compassionate, is the ground on which real equality stands. And on that note, I say thank you. Please come again. Any final questions or thoughts?
I see you've been thinking about this. You spent a lot of time putting this together.
Yes, it was definitely something that I've been because I'm, especially with this one, I felt the most nervous about this presentation because I'm dealing not just with assault and rape and stuff like that, but also mechanisms to move beyond. And I knew that was some scary territory. So I had to speak to lots of people here, trying to find that right tone and voice.
I can imagine that you got a lot of pushback. People like, oh, you've never, like the nerve, like you don't know what it's like, or blah, blah, blah. And you're trying to start a dialogue. I can imagine people can be prickly about that if you ask them and they're like, oh, you don't know anything, right?
Yes, there were a couple, mercifully, and again, I thank my brownness is so helpful in these situations. If I was a white guy, I think I would be dead. My racial heritage allowed me to be able to speak from a cultural perspective. And because I try to bring the conversation into big picture analysis, I try as much as I can not to get caught up in someone's personal emotional drama, because that's where it can get very messy very quickly. So when someone starts saying things like, well, you don't know, I've experienced this and da 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 da, I will immediately say, yes, I honor your personal experience, but I'm trying to speak big picture. What is happening to society? Everyone's individual story is different. I can never, in all these presentations, never will I be speaking to an individual and saying, this is you. What I'm doing is speaking statistically, big picture. Some people will identify with parts of it and some will not. What I do try to say is no one is a spokesperson for their group. I'm brown, but I don't speak for Indians. My experience is personal. And same thing with any woman or man, their experience is personal. I'm happy to hear the personal story. And sometimes that personal story can be an indicator of a bigger picture. But everyone's personal journey is still unique, which is what fascinates me about humans, is that a person can have all these different beliefs, which make you think that they're going to be one way, but then they turn out to be something else completely. And people are like that. They have their own individual situations and stories. And that's what I try to do, is marry that yin and yang, the personal with the political, trying to bring it always back to the big picture.
Yeah, you're very approachable, and I think that like as more people start coming, they'll feel comfortable talking about it, you know.
Thank you. Well, when I get back to Montreal, that's what I'm hoping to do, is to do more in-person talks. And I was thinking of doing wine and cheese in the beginning, but I might get in trouble. And also because of the subject matter of some of the next future talks, I'm like, I don't want to get a wine bottle thrown at me. So maybe I'll keep it non-alcoholic.
Yeah, alcohol is not always the best thing to mix into.
I was gonna say you can have the event at my apartment, but after you said somebody might throw a wine bottle, like I'm not gonna offer that.
No, but it won't be alcohol. We'll go to the bar afterwards. Like the idea,
you'll have to do box wine, but
that'll hurt less.
Just those sharp corners you have to worry about. Other than that, it's totally safe.
I'm gonna wear a helmet when I come into these events, just in case.
Do it out in the park, like a wine and cheese picnic, and then you can just run for cover under a tree or something.
Exactly. Well, that's what I'm figuring. I'm going to start off non-alcoholic, feel the vibe, and if the vibe is good at the end, then like, hey guys, you want to go and have a drink afterwards? Boom.
But thank you so much for hosting it, and good luck with the rest of the events. And good job. It was really interesting.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I really do. And slowly, as I evolve with it and get my voice, yes, it's the idea is to keep it growing, to keep dialogue happening.